because often I find when I'm working with students, they do a lot of world building pre-writing, um, where they're just doing notebooks upon notebooks and tell me about the political system and why
Yeah.
it's important and everything like that. But I kind of like your approach, which is you do it.
Hey, this is Writers Row, where we talk about the writing community on Twitter. We talk about the writing process, including the creative side and the business side. I am your host, as always, DC Wright-Hammer, the author of the science fiction thriller series Between Two Minds, and joined, as always, by
David Gane, the YA mystery writer. I know I'm full of energy tonight. I do the Shepherd and Wolf mysteries. Along Comes the Wolf, Shepherd's Watch, Wolf in Shepherd's Clothing, and hopefully someday it'll come out Wolf's, or what is it called? Shepherd's Call.
You're asking us.
No, I'm just making it up as we go along.
and
There's a fifth book too, but we're announcing number 4 a bit. So, oh, there's somebody else with us, DC.
Oh, right. We have a very special guest making a return on Writers Row, and I will let her do her introduction more justice than I can.
My name is Meg Trast. I am an editor. I'm also the author of Write That Book You Keep Talking About, How to Stop Planning and Start Drafting. Thank you guys for having me back for round 2. I'm excited.
This one's going to be a lot looser, right? We're just going to fight with each other. Is that the intention?
We have to meet in Lebanon, Kansas, and just wield PVC pipes at each other.
Oh yeah, because that's the center, right? But that's still like
center.
An extra hour and a half of driving from me.
Center of the universe, let's be honest.
It's only like 3 hours from me, so I get the best deal out of this. I'll be the least tired. That's how I'll win.
Let's meet in Moose Jaw.
I don't even know where that is.
It's in Saskatchewan. It's mentioned in the old TV show Northern Exposure as Meg looks on her world map.
Yeah, it's not going to be up there.
Yeah, look at that. That's a good tie-in. What are we talking about today as Meg looks at her world map, DC?
Yeah.
We are talking about world building in writing, and we can expand it. It doesn't have to just be for writing in books and things like that. We could talk movies and so on and so forth. But the concept of not simply following a character here or there, but actually placing the reader in a world, in a place that may or may not mirror our own world, and being able to describe that and flesh that out to some extent. And so I want to challenge David on this. I'm going to put him on the spot because just like in other episodes, he has very strong opinions on world building. So David,
I want to do like a before we dive into it, I want to see what each of you guys, how you define world building. What falls under the category of world building versus like just setting?
Yep.
Oh. See, and I think some of my responses will come out from that, but this doesn't include everything, but the historical, the political, the religious, the societal, the geographical. What else would be in there? I guess all the different species that would live on that world, in that world.
So you think of it more in the sense of like actually creating a fictional world that is totally original and there's not an existing map for, basically.
No, it can be. Absolutely. Like, to me, you can do... To me, honestly, in my mind, my series of books is set in present day and it's supposedly set in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, but none of the places exist there.
It's like alternate Saskatchewan.
A little bit, yeah. Like there are certain places that exist, but we have murders occurring in schools, for example. We don't really want to paint the schools with those real schools with those kind of things. So we started building it, and then we built up the map of where they are in the city in our own version. Or in book 2, I took the main river that goes through Saskatchewan and reversed the direction and created a town and everything like that. So I think that's still a part of world building, really.
I think that's
also
valid.
I'm defining the way certain towns exist and everything like that. So do you agree?
I agree. I think that's valid. I still.
That's me patting myself on my back.
I'm still
Fixing your
seeing
tag.
some setting in there, which are it's a fuzzy line. There's no like sharp line between, I think, setting and world building. What do you think of as world building, DC?
So it depends on the genre, I think. I think it's important if you're doing a fantasy or sci-fi, you tend to want to differentiate it from the real world in a lot of cases, and so you do spend time on setting. Is there different sort of physics at work? Is there different, sciences, and are we redefining whole, banks of knowledge that we have in the real world to make this piece of fiction feel more, how can we get our readers inside this piece of fiction? And you do it with how, what rules govern how your characters interact. Like, is there any kind of special circumstance that brings them together or drives them apart? And that goes back to some of the things that David was saying. Is there politics, religion? Is there interspecies interactions? Is there so I think it's I think, yeah, setting is a part of it. There's the Venn diagram of setting and world building, but really getting your reader to forget that they're reading fiction, getting them sort of on board with the rules of your story is basically what I think world building is. Getting them on board with what are we playing by? What kind of rules are we playing by? And putting those in place so that they can just enjoy the story.
Okay, so this is the question I have, because I think you may have misunderstood one of my points, which I'll get to, why I hate the idea, a lot of what comes out of world building. When you said, well, there's some setting involved in there, if it's not setting that covers world building, what is it, Meg?
So I think of a setting as sort of where each event is happening. It's like your setting would be Saskatchewan, right? But then your world building would be alternate Saskatchewan. And I think of world building, I really liked the way that Emma Bull described it at Narrativity. She said, to me, I've created, say I drew my map. We can call that world building, we can call that setting. But now I have this character, and it's in a medieval time period, and I have this character, and I want her to have a wardrobe. I want her to have these outfits in these colors.
Yeah.
So my world building at that point is going to be, what dyes do I need to make this cloth? Is that dye going to be accessible to a person of this social or financial status? How practical is it for that person to acquire? How does it affect the economy around them?
Yeah.
It's, the politics. I don't remember who said politics, economy, all that stuff. To me, any element that you have to sort of invent or twist in order for it to work in your story, that's world building. And everything else is just the room that you're in.
Absolutely. I would say, I always think of it, because I come from a film background, when you are watching something that, I'm just trying to think of a good example, like when they did Lord of the Rings, right? Peter Jackson.
Yeah.
he had to him and his team, I shouldn't say the team had to come up with all of it, right? What did the armor look like? What did the costumes look like? Battle techniques, the creatures and stuff like that, of course, but also even like a bit of the process of going to war was explored in where did they get the materials to build the weapons to go to war and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of stuff as well. So I always think of it as that you've got that team of people in film where you're building those kind of things, and it's kind of the same idea, because when they're talking about it, they're like, oh, okay, well, this person doesn't have that kind of money, so of course they're going to have to use this kind of cloth instead of this kind of armor or whatever sort of thing. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Sorry, I'm getting into this.
You're fine. Yeah, no, go. That's why we're here.
I always love that. Like, I don't mind the idea of doing that. Because I love the depth. The depth gives you your characters something to work with. For me, whenever I talk about world building with my students, I always talk to them about, okay, it's really great if you do all that work, but if it doesn't show up in the story, then that's a lot of work I always fear about extra work, right? When you focus so much on that, you aren't doing the actual writing and the work and everything like that. So for me, every one of those pieces always has to relate to the action of the story, the action of the characters, right?
Absolutely.
And it can work so really, really well, right? Like, I'm trying to come up with the deep version of this. Maybe one of the characters is got some strange disease, but because of their social economic status, they can't get the medicine, so then they have to go on the quest. And that's really slim and trim and everything like that. But I like that because you start pulling into, oh, somebody's come to visit us.
Yeah.
DC's cat is a regular on the show. I think there should be a drinking game for Writers Row where the cat appears and then you get to drink.
Yes.
We get to drink.
If she meows, you have to take a drink.
So it's a drink for appearance and maybe a shot for a meow.
There we go.
If I actually put her on camera, you got to down your drink. But drink responsibly, drink responsibly. Don't listen to me. I'm joking. And so I think, David, your film background, I think, lends itself to the world builds itself as the story and characters progress. They don't.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
They're not mutually exclusive, and if you there's some genres that can get away with it to some extent, but if you spend a whole chapter talking about the fields and the sky and the lakes and all this stuff, I'm not saying there isn't an audience for that. However, it tends to feel mechanical. You're almost making what we talked about, if people remember in our last episode, killing your darlings. It's almost like making world building a darling, and you don't want to go on a field trip in the middle of telling your story to some extent. You take your characters there. If you need to talk about a special place, and my cat is really passionate about this. If you need to talk about a special place, take the story there, take the characters there, and flesh it out as we go. Maybe there's some inner dialogue or something going on in the character's head, giving us a little bit of background. You don't want to spend a whole lot of time there, but that gives us enough information to get us in the building that is special. And then while we're there, what's their first interaction? They meet a security guard or they meet somebody of authority, and that stops them in their tracks. And that you're sort of building with, barriers. You're building with the character experiencing the story rather than just painting a picture, which again, I'm not saying is wrong in some cases, in some genres. I'm just saying for majority of modern fiction, we try to tend to stay away from that.
So there is a school of thought that I'm subscribed to, and actually, if you look at my Twitter handle, it says Meg Trast PJF. The PJF stands for Pre-Joycean Fellowship, and what that basically means is that there can be a marriage between artistic literature or purple prose and storytelling, wherein you are not full-on Tolkien, where you're talking for pages and pages and pages and pages about what everything looks like. But you're also not Ernest Hemingway, where you're just like, nope, you've got to get straight to it. Don't describe anything. Go. So I think there's a happy medium in that a lot of purple prose and expanding upon what the characters see visually is overcompensation to avoid white room syndrome. Like, well, I want my readers to be able to see the setting, and I think finding that balance is not always easy. And so and I think it's okay to overwrite in your first draft, and I always talk about this when I talk about first drafts. Whatever's in there, just throw it on the paper. You know, don't edit yourself while you're writing, something that I'm super guilty of doing. But just let it talk about the trees and the grass, and then kill your darlings. You know, if they don't work, then get them out of there. You don't need them. You don't need all those trees. What are they contributing to your story? And I think a lot of people think of world building too, and think of like I want to compare it to like Dungeons and Dragons, like building a D&D campaign, which I've never done, but my dad was super into D&D, and he would draw maps and maps and maps and come up with all of this stuff for every contingency. And when you're telling a story, you don't need all of those contingencies. You don't even have to know what they are in advance. Once you get to that point in the story, make some crap up, and then when you're editing, come up with a reason for it and tweak everything else to fit. Clear the fog. You don't have to do it all right away.
Yep.
I do like the idea that, because often I find when I'm working with students, they do a lot of world building pre-writing, where they're just doing notebooks upon notebooks and tell me about the political system and why it's important and everything like that. But I kind of like your approach, which is you do it in the moment of the first draft, right? You do explore it, and you dig deeper into it, and you can I really like the example about the clothing at the start that you mentioned, which, you know, you can explore that, you can kind of dig in there and feel around. And then when you come back to it, you can say, okay, well, obviously this is not guiding me anywhere, but you can take that chunk of work. It's not lost work. You put it to your, your save file.
Exactly.
And you might come back to it, or you may, on book 3 that you're writing of your 20-book series, you're like, hey, I had that thing in that one part, and I can bring that back, and it makes really much more sense.
Here's my story from the clothmaker's perspective, and I have all of the hard work done for that.
Because we really needed to know that now.
Well, and I'll give 2 real-world examples on how I've run across world building in the books that I'm writing. And in my first book was actually going to be much longer. It's 125,000 words already. But it's going to be much longer because I wanted to do a lot of sci-fi world building. And what I realized as I'm going through it is that the first book could stand alone without that sci-fi world building. And in fact, it made it a more intimate, character-driven experience. And I did a little bit of world building here or there, but I found myself with 60,000 words of world building that I just couldn't justify putting in book 1. And so I turned around, I published book 1, and then book 2 became both driving the central narrative forward, but then the interleave narrative that I do in my series allowed me to do that world building, alternating with the main story and sort of fleshing out. So I broke a rule in book 1 by not by doing a very complex narrative, and then in book 2 I did a prequel and a sequel in the same book, and did all the world building, but the whole thing is just moving forward. That's the other side. It's all moving forward at the same side. And so I that's where don't throw out those scraps. Those editing scraps allowed me to turn around 18 months after publishing, not even 18 months. It was 11 months after publishing, no, 12 months, 13 months after publishing book 1.
Number keeps getting bigger.
14, 15, 16.
Well, see, I started before.
Sorry.
But I published book 2 a year later, and it was longer. It was 130,000 words. And so I was able to turn it around quick. So don't get rid of those scraps. Second, on my current, one of the whips that I'm working on.
Whips. I like that you call them whips.
Right.
What do you call it?
Work in progresses.
It's works in progress.
Right.
And the first one's plural.
In Canada, we call them wipes.
Wipes.
Something lost in translation there, David.
Thanks.
You need a lot of wipes. Anyway, so in one of my, I can't say sips. Okay, that doesn't work either.
Just say works in progress or whips is fine. I just thought it was funny because that's how I read it in my head.
I have a whip.
What did you just call it? A wisps?
I was trying to pluralize the W inside the acronym.
Wisps.
Right, but then you're still pluralizing it anyway.
Oh yeah, wisp.
Anyone watching this episode is like, what is happening?
They're like, this is the best episode ever.
And my cat hasn't meowed enough for them to be drunk enough in this episode in order to
start drinking before the episode. That was the rule.
You have to drink a beer first, and then you start drinking again for the game.
So long
row. Okay. Fair.
Shotgun a beer, watch some Writers Row. I'm kidding.
That is the life of a writer right there.
Yeah.
Shotgun a beer, watch Writers Row.
Long story.
Long
story long. One of my whips has an info dump in it, and I'm going to turn it into 2 chapters. But it's a good thing I info dumped because I need that. I need that information for the story. All right.
This is the best episode ever.
If this doesn't get all the thumbs up and all the subscribers, I don't know what will.
Meg's like, what have I got myself into here? And it's so warm.
It's my fault. I started in.
She fell for it again. This once bitten, twice it's her fault.
Oh.
So, anyway.
So we were talking about what again?
World
drinking.
Building.
World building. Yes, that's very true.
World building. Everyone drinks so much that they can't stay on topic.
Okay, so here's my question. You said that at the conference that you were at, there was a lot of discussion.
Oh yeah.
Why were people so passionate about it?
Well, the most of the discussion seemed to stem from the differences between setting and world building. And everyone was really wanting to slap labels onto the different elements of doing that, and not move on with the topic. Like let's say that I've set a scene in this medieval character's closet. So you have elements of setting there because you could describe the dresses that are, hanging in the armoire. But that would be setting, but also it's world building because you have to have all this background to justify that being there. And then some other people were arguing about, like, well, where do you draw the line at world building? And I think your example about alternate Saskatchewan is actually a really good example of what the conversation was moving into there, because a lot of people seem to disagree on whether real world settings involved any world building. And carrying that over to fantasy, like you might be inventing a system of bartering, but you take bartering from real life. You might be inventing a landscape, but you take landscape elements from real life. And they were sort of trying to invent a new color, like, well, can you think of a color that doesn't exist? No. Everything takes from everything. Everything is always and has always been derivative. So a lot of the argument was just about, well, what is world building versus setting?
Well, and my fear comes back to that question is, okay, we're in the closet, we're looking at those clothes. Why do we need to know as much as we need to know for us to move the story forward unless there's something that will pay off later?
Substantial. And that's the thing. I don't think that you, except for the sake of realism, and believability, that actually segues nicely into the next point I wanted to make is suspension of disbelief. How much crap can I make my reader believe? Like, how much can I make up that my reader's going to go, okay, yeah, I believe that. And it goes back to selling them on the little things. Jen Phalion, as someone else I follow on Twitter in the writing community, shared a thread today actually about ice cream sandwich. And there's a setting that takes place it's like some kind of medical setting. And there's a scene taking place. Someone's got an ice cream sandwich in their hand. They get one bite of it before an emergency erupts. They have to set the sandwich down, and then they take off for like half an hour. Come back, eat their sandwich, and then pick chocolate chips out of their teeth. So there's so many things to break down there. First of all, why isn't that ice cream sandwich melted? Why do I believe that they were able to pick up their ice cream sandwich? Why were there chocolate chips in it?
Yeah.
I had very few ice cream sandwiches with chocolate chips in them. So if the author's getting these things that I am familiar with and understand, if they're not making sense there, what else are they getting wrong? Where else are they, like, where else are you going to be taken out of the story and have your suspension of disbelief falter because of those little details?
Well, and I think that's really key, because world building, there's some necessity depending on your story that you have to do some kind of world building. Yes, we've talked about how it needs to be part of the story, but it can be as much of a hindrance farther into the story as it can be something that immerses your reader in it. And so the example I'll give is with the series, the TV series Game of Thrones. Early in the series, travel took forever.
Yes.
And was very important to the
The
series.
plot.
But later on, suddenly people are just there at the place, and it's not that important because they have to move the story forward. And
Yep.
so world building can be both a blessing to immerse your reader, and then it can just as easily kick them out of the story if you don't follow your own rules.
Yep. And that's the other thing. I like to use, there's 2 Doctor Who episodes that I love to reference when I'm talking about this. They both fall under the same umbrella, and I'm getting into nerd territory, I know, but bear with me, it's relevant. The Weeping Angels. How familiar are you guys with that?
Yeah.
So there's an episode. One of the scariest things I've ever seen on TV. There's statues, right? There's these statues that the main characters come across that have their faces covered. They're called the Weeping Angels. If you are not looking at them, whenever you cannot see them, they can move. And I believe the episode is called Don't Blink if you want to watch it and then not sleep. So we have these rules set out. If you're not looking at the statue, It can move. We're never explicitly told what will happen if it catches up with you. It doesn't happen, which is part of the magic, part of what makes the episode so scary.
They're just getting close.
Just getting closer. That's the creep factor. And you turn around and it's right here, and it's got its hand up. Like, well, what would have happened in that next second, which is a good example of, cut to black. You say a lot more sometimes with what you don't say, but there is a follow-up episode to that. I believe it's called The Angels Take Manhattan.
I feel like it is, yeah.
And suddenly the rules have changed. And now we understand what it is the angels do. And it's not just the angels, but it's every statue. And suddenly this, and suddenly this, all things that work to make the plot work, but it changes the rules. And as a result, if you go back to that episode previously, it's just not as scary. You've undone your work. Mm-hmm. And so, like in Game of Thrones, so many people made the fast travel joke. Oh, I guess they've unlocked fast travel now. Right. It took away something. It took away something. So whenever you set rules in your universe to have a specific effect, you have to stay with them. And if it hinders your plot, you're going to have to find a way to work around it.
Yeah, or if you're going to break them, give a good reason.
A reason.
Breaking them. Yeah. So what were you going to say, David?
Well, I actually, that's one of those things I really love is setting a rule into place and then letting that rule cause you chaos in telling your story. Like, I'm all about obstacle and making it hard on your character, and I love that kind of stuff. Like, if it's making life harder, then let's do it and see what happens.
Yeah.
Of course, it'll get me into trouble just as much, right? Like I'll be like, yeah, this is great. Oh, great. Now I got to work around that kind of thing.
Right.
But I do think that the idea of rules is good, but then, and I almost feel like we're kind of hitting two things, which is how much do you describe and how little do you describe? Because in the example of the Weeping Angels, it's like, yeah, the Weeping Angels, the less we knew, the rules were pretty simple, but we didn't know what the outcome was, right?
Yeah.
So then let's go back to your closet, and then we're locked in there, and how much do we need to know about the clothing and everything like that? Or is it we just define it when that moment is important, sort of thing?
I think that's a good thing to be thinking about too. Like, I don't have to explain to you, or pretty much I would say most readers, I don't have to explain horses graze on grass. You can say the horses are grazing, and you don't have to like follow their genealogy back up to their Neolithic ancestors or whatever.
Although I really would like to know that.
Can we get a book about that, please? I'm trying to think of an example. Someone mentioned characters moving through a fantasy setting in maybe like older stories, and nothing being described to say how they survived, how they found water, how they stayed warm, how they found food. And the reason why is because back when those stories were written, it was common knowledge. This wasn't a thing that you had to describe. Everybody knows horses graze on grass. Everybody knows that you look for these things when you're looking for potable water. So I think having an understanding of what your audience probably knows, and then even if you don't talk about the economy that allowed you to have peach-colored silk in your wardrobe in the 1800s, if you know it and you know how that tracks, you don't have to share that with anybody. I edited for an author who wrote a sci-fi book, and they set forth. Or they didn't set forth any rules. So they had this method of travel, and in the comments, like the review pane, there was a bunch of notes like need to work out how this works, need to work out how this works. And it was very clear as the story moved through the plot, you could tell the author didn't have a set of rules. So not that they necessarily needed to tell the reader what the rules were, but there needed to be a level of here's how these things work. I know it, and I'm going to hold on to that until you need to know it. You don't need to know it at all. And I think that's an important element of world building, is understanding what does your audience know, what do they need to know, what do I need to know, and knowing the difference.
Actually, that is another place that I have come across it, which is in horror scripts or in horror writing, where you define the rules of the monster and then you have to stay to those rules as well. And yeah, you may not explicitly need to say what the rules are, but you need to know that if the monster can't do this or the monster can do this, that has to stay consistent as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I feel like you paint yourself into a corner in some of the, I guess, I'm trying to think of an example, but when you get to the end and they have to break the rules suddenly in order to end the story.
Yeah.
Where, the monster was impervious, and then we find the one, one thing that it's allergic to, and I'll use signs as an example, like, right. You get all the way to the end, these super scary monsters, such good cinematography and storytelling, and you get to
almost
the end,
a great movie.
And it's this is really the twist. The twist is that these higher order beings are going to a planet that is 70% water, inhabited by beings that are 70% water, and they're.
I have to blame M. Night Shyamalan for that, because everyone wants to have a twist now.
Right. I appreciate a good twist.
Yeah, but you don't have to have one.
No,
I agree with that. But if you've been building up and you leave seeds, you leave little bits. It's where you look at the closet with the cloth in it, and later that's where they hide from, somebody. Like, the reason why we gazed into that closet is because it becomes, a place where
there's a smell coming from the closet, and you imagine you wouldn't be able to smell anything else if that was all that was in your nose.
Sure.
Lo and behold, that's where we have to hide 6 chapters later.
Or going back to Game of Thrones, people die and they go away, except for, there's this fire god who can bring them back to life. Let's show this side character being brought back to life. And then we can bring Jon Snow back to life, and people will mostly not be mad at it. Like,
yeah, no, if you define, things, and one of my favorite things I ever heard was readers like to be rewarded for paying attention. And I think that over-explaining and hammering rules in can be just annoying, and your reader's going to feel like, oh, this author thinks I'm dumb. So you want to share just enough of your world so that when your climax happens, or when the big reveal happens, your reader can either go, I knew it, or they can read back a second time and go, oh, duh. One of the authors I just sent back a proofread for, William Beswick, wrote a book called Hate Mail, and it's going to be out soon. But there were things I missed during the copy edit that not that I missed, but that I didn't register. Just things I glossed over, and I went back during the proofread, and I was like, oh my gosh, duh. Duh.
Right. And that's the balance between being too heavy-handed and being too subtle, and there's a lot of responsibility on the reader when the author is subtle with some of those decisions. So
which I think is its own discussion, and it is.
Yeah.
And
But
so
that's a good reason to decide, where in your world building you want to share things and to actually put it in, or to put it in your scrap folder and hold on to it for something else.
yeah, or you can info dump it like me. And with that, we will wrap up this episode. And we're doing another giveaway. So this is the theme that we started doing. What we're gonna do for this episode of Writers Row is anybody who's releasing a book in the near future and they'd like to get some publicity on it, we're gonna give you a 30-second ad spot at the opening of a episode that's coming up. And so to be part of that, if you want to be at least eligible, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You're following all three of us. You have to follow Meg too. Because she's on this episode. And then I will link I'll put in the description below how you can be entered to win that 30-second spot. So appreciate everybody watching. Meg, appreciate you coming back on and putting up with David and me one more time.
It's my pleasure.
You're going to be a regular, I can already tell. David, any final thoughts?
No. Bye.
He said no.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.